back to RxTales. I'm Dr. Mark, and today we're going to be talking about the Opium Wars. So the history of pharmacy is really fascinating. If you've been watching these videos, I hope you think so too. Drugs have influenced major historical events and play a big part into shaping the world into what it is today. The history of pharmacy is essentially the history of drugs and their relationship with people and culture. Now, if you think the opioid epidemic is a new phenomenon, think again. Today, we'll take a look at the long history of opium and the terrifying impact of 19th century British narco-terrorism. If you think I'm being hyperbolic, I'm not. You probably already know how devastating opioid addiction can be, but I'll bet you don't know the whole story behind the Opium Wars and how the U.S. Navy, drugs, and international politics helped bring about the downfall of the Japanese samurai. Just stick with me, and let's get into it. Well, first off, let's talk about opium. This story goes way, way back. I'm talking the dawn of agriculture. So humans first domesticated plants around 10,000 BCE, give or take. Now, the first crops that were domesticated were grains and legumes like peas and beans. But shortly after that, our ancient farming ancestors domesticated a whole bunch of medicinal and psychoactive plants. Among these was the poppy, Papaver somniferum. The poppy, as you may already know, produces a drug called opium. Now, this is for informational purposes only. Okay, do not try this at home. To harvest the opium, the bulb of the poppy plant is scored with a sharp instrument, and the milky white sap that oozes out dries into a sticky brown resin. This substance is called opium. Opium contains two drugs, morphine and, to a much lesser degree, codeine. Morphine gets its name from Morpheus, the Greek god of sleep, because it makes you drowsy. So opium's medicinal effects were known far and wide in the ancient world. But why all the hype? Well, morphine is a very powerful drug. It's the OG opioid and has a profound effect on the human body. It relieves pain and produces a feeling of euphoria and well-being. It slows down the GI tract, reducing hunger and stopping diarrhea. It suppresses coughing by slowing the respiratory rate. But there's also a dark side to this potent natural medicine. As use continues, the body develops a tolerance to the effects of morphine. The user requires higher and higher doses to get the same effect. The euphoria and the pain relief diminish, and the user has to consume larger doses at an increasing frequency in order to get the same effect. The user becomes dependent and has to keep using morphine in order to prevent the undesirable withdrawal symptoms from this highly powerful narcotic. So opium is part of our history. Really, it's like the ultimate drug. No other substance has such a profound duality in our culture as both a miraculous cure and a deadly poison. So, have we always had widespread opioid addiction? Well, not necessarily. The modern opioid epidemic is only possible because of a global supply chain and industrial scale manufacturing. Well, in ancient times, addiction certainly occurred, but the infrastructure needed to produce and transport a global supply of opium all the way around the world didn't exist until the 1500s. Which brings us to colonialism. You see, in the 16th century, European explorers sailed off all around the world looking for what? Spices, right? That's what they tell us in the history books. In school, you probably learned about Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama and Marco Polo, who were looking for new routes to the Orient, to the East, to the countries of Eastern Asia, And all those guys were looking for spices. Why spices? What were these spices? Well, I'll tell you. Ginger, cinnamon, turmeric, tea, coffee, cannabis, tobacco, and many, many more. In other words, drugs. They weren't looking for new and interesting food seasonings. They were looking for drugs. See, as Europe expanded its colonial empires and established predictable trade routes, they began to scale up as demand for exotic goods increased, like tea. By the late 1700s, tea was the biggest import commodity in Europe. Europeans could not get enough tea. Europeans drank so much tea in the 1700s that the widespread, massive consumption of caffeine is considered to be a significant factor in the explosion of scientific and intellectual advancement that today we call the Enlightenment.
A very strong case can be made that caffeine contributed to the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason and the Industrial Revolution, all of which required us to think in much more focused linear terms.
This was the time of Isaac Newton and Voltaire, John Locke, Rene Descartes, Benjamin Franklin, and so on and so on. All these guys drank a ton of tea. But tea doesn't grow in Europe. So to ensure a consistent supply of caffeine for its growing populace, Britain exploited its colonies to ensure the best deal that they could get. You see, Britain wanted tea from China, which is where it grows. And China, though, didn't really have an interest in European goods. And they would only accept payment in silver. Now, this was getting to be an expensive habit for the British, as tons and tons of British silver piled up in China as they continued to pay for their tea that they couldn't go without. After a while, the British saw an opportunity and began to buy back this silver in exchange for opium, which it grew on its large poppy plantations in India. Now, opium was not a new drug to China. It had been around since at least the 8th century from Arab traders. However, smoking opium was relatively new. It was introduced to China by way of Dutch merchants somewhere in the early 1600s. Chinese writers, right around the 1720s, they described the awful impact of this very addictive practice of smoking opium. They described how foreign merchants were getting rich and young people's lives were getting destroyed. They urged the emperor to take action, which led to the Yongjing Edict of 1729, which banned the importation of opium for smoking. Medical opium remained legal, but smokable product was now forbidden. For this reason, the British East India Company stayed mostly on the up and up throughout most of the 18th century, as they risked losing their lucrative trading privileges if they got caught smuggling opium. Throughout the 1700s, up until around 1790, the amount of opium imported into China was relatively low and predominantly, but not always, for legitimate medical use. Now, this trade was operated during the 1700s almost exclusively by Portuguese merchants who imported the drug from their colonies in Indonesia, as well as poppy farms in India and the Ottoman Empire. Yes, opium smoking still occurred in China during the 1700s. However, its legal status confined it to the black market, mostly in the port of Guangzhou, which was the only port open to foreign trade, and the island of Taiwan. Also, during this time, 2 forms of opium emerged on the market. The first type, called Medak, was from Indonesia, and it was a blend of opium and tobacco, and sometimes cannabis. Medak was relatively inexpensive and could be fiery and irritating to smoke, kind of like the cheap cigarettes. Opium from India, on the other hand, which was called Patna, was a pure opium product, all killer, no filler. It was smooth and pleasant to the taste, and it commanded a premium price. So in the late 1700s, the British East India Company made a very bold and strategic move to create a monopoly on the opium trade, which would set the stage for the Opium Wars in the following century. You see, the Qing Empire in China was growing more and more concerned about opium abuse among its people, and it outlawed all trade in opium in 1796. Because of this, trade moved exclusively to the black market. Prices increased. The following year, in 1797, the East India Company, which had been buying up all the poppy farms in India over the last several years, abruptly stopped producing opium. Now, this power play drained the market of cheap, low-grade Medak opium. Maybe you're thinking, why didn't Portugal just increase its supply of opium to meet the demand? Well, things weren't exactly good at home. Portugal had been fighting and losing successive wars since 1794. It was financially drained and in no shape to compete with Britain. Well, at this point, with market demand at an all-time high, the East India Company then ramped up production of high-quality opium. Merchants from across the globe raced to get in on the very lucrative dope smuggling trade. Everyone was involved. British, Middle Eastern, Dutch, Portuguese, Jewish, even American traders were getting a piece of the lucrative Chinese opium market. Not to mention pirates. Now, the only Chinese trade center open to foreigners was the port of Guangzhou. As smuggling increased, China responded by closing the port to all foreign trade in 1820. All foreign traders now had to do business on Lingding Island, off the coast in the bay there. It seemed like a good idea at the time. However, this offshore depot allowed Britain to stockpile huge quantities of high-grade opium, away from oversight by Chinese officials, which they then used to flood the market. This inexhaustible supply of high-grade opium, combined with China's continued efforts to enforce prohibition, resulted in perhaps the biggest and most profitable black market in the history of the world. From 1820 onwards, the opium trade generated tremendous wealth for Britain. By 1838, it was bringing in £3 million a year. That's equivalent to like $500 million today. China was being drained financially, and all it was getting in return was an opioid crisis. The Qing emperor was pissed. Even members of the army and government officials were getting hooked on opium. So what did the Chinese do? Well, in 1839, the emperor appointed a guy named Lin Zexu to put a stop to the opium trade once and for all. Now, Lin Zexu was a hardline anti-drug politician. He wrote to Queen Victoria in London and said that any foreign merchant caught bringing opium into China would be sentenced to death by hanging or beheading. Now, Lin Zexu wasn't all talk either. Dude was standing on business. In just a few months on the job, military troops under his command had confiscated 7,000 opium pipes, arrested hundreds of drug dealers. They also seized and destroyed 3 million pounds of mostly British opium from storehouses on Lingding Island. That's about the same amount as 37 fully loaded semi-trucks. That's a lot of drugs. It took 500 workers about 3 weeks to dump it all in the ocean. The British weren't too happy about losing all of their dope, and so they sent in the Navy to attack Chinese ships along coastal forts. Now, this was the start of what came to be known as the First Opium War, which lasted until about 1842. It was not a fair fight. Not only was China outmatched militarily, losing 800,000 troops to a British army of only 12,000, the British also hired Chinese mercenaries to fight against their own people. And it deployed deep state counterintelligence agents to spread opposition. After the war, Britain went full-on revenge mode by forcing China to sign the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, followed by the Treaty of the Bogue in 1843. These humiliating agreements forced China to hand over the port city of Hong Kong to Britain, which it controlled until 1997. It also gave Britain most favored nation trade status, opened 4 additional ports to foreign trade, Shanghai, Ningbo, Fuzhou, and Xiamen. It gave British citizens immunity from following Chinese laws, granted amnesty to Chinese citizens who had assisted the British during the war, and made China pay $21 million to the British to compensate them for their now destroyed opium stockpile. In 1844, other Western nations, specifically France and the United States, they saw what Britain was doing, and they decided to help China get back on its feet. They basically took advantage of China at its most vulnerable and demanded essentially the same deal. These were the first of what came to be known as the unequal treaties, and they caused a great deal of resentment among the Chinese people towards the Western nations. Tensions grew, and another war broke out in 1856. This was the Second Opium War. It was sparked by several incidents, including the capture of a British ship by Chinese pirates and the murder of a French missionary. Well, this time, Britain and France both ganged up on China, while the US and Russia basically stood by and watched. It was brutal. China was defeated for a second time and forced into yet another series of punitive treaties, giving Britain, France, Russia, and the United States even more control over Chinese trade. They forced China to establish freedom of religion, at least for Russian Orthodox, Catholics, and Protestants, opened even more trade ports to the West, and most devastatingly, forced China to legalize opium. This begins what the Chinese call the Century of Humiliation. China became saturated with opium, leading to widespread opioid addiction and all the bad stuff that goes along with it. But how does this relate to the samurai? I did promise you a connection here, and I will come through. We need to go back in time just a few years from this point and turn our attention to Japan. So, following the First Opium War, the U.S. began to build up its naval presence in the Pacific. Seeing what Britain had done with China, the United States wanted to stake its own claim in the Asian trade market in Japan. In the summer of 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Tokyo Bay with a squadron of steam-powered gunboats and threatened to burn the city to the ground if they did not permit him to land. He delivered the terms of the U.S. government and left, giving Japan about a year to think it over. This not-so-subtle tactic became known as gunboat diplomacy. You see, up until this point, Japan had been a mostly isolated country, sealed off from the vast majority of trade with the West. However, they didn't live on an island. They did, but it's a metaphor. Just go with it. So Japan saw what was happening to China, and they could read the writing on the wall. Western nations wanted to tap those assets and engage in trade, and they weren't going to take no for an answer. Now, Japan's ruling class, the shogunate, they wanted to keep Japan isolated and not get involved. But Commodore Perry was coming back. And as much as Japan did not want to open its ports to the U.S., it also knew that resistance was futile. The shogunate feared that outside influence would disrupt their caste system, throwing their whole social order out of balance. But their biggest fear was ending up like China, forced into submission to Western powers and caught in the stranglehold of nationwide opioid addiction. So what does Japan do? They strategize. So when Perry returns in 1854, they sign the treaty, opening the country to trade with the United States. But then they get to work, using the open trade network to their advantage. As early as 1860, Japan begins sending envoys to the United States to learn everything they can about the industrial world. No longer cut off from the rest of the globe, they study Western culture, customs, language, science, and technology. They send students to military and naval academies, both in the US and Europe, to learn about modern warfare. They build nationwide telegraph lines, railroads, shipyards, mines, and all types of factories. The shogunate's power rapidly diminished as progressive leaders rapidly modernized the country. By the end of the 19th century, Japan had become the biggest economic and military powerhouse in all of Asia, all because of drugs. Oh, and what happened to China? Well, after the Opium Wars, China struggled with widespread opioid addiction for almost 100 years. Rates of addiction were up to 90% in some coastal areas. So Dr. Stan Florek of the Australian Museum, I think, said it best. I'm going to quote him here. The wars subdued China to foreign imperial exploitation and undermined its ability to govern itself effectively and to defend its independence. They resulted in a long period of unrest punctuated by famines, revolts, and armed conflicts. The number of deaths, destruction, and human suffering is difficult to quantify. By 1949, when the Communist Party came to power in China, over 20 million people suffered from opioid addiction throughout the country. The new government mobilized a massive campaign to combat China's opioid epidemic. And they did this using propaganda, mass media, as well as nationwide publicly organized meetings in community centers and rehab facilities, where former opium users would share their stories and help others to recover from opioid addiction. Now, communism played an important role in this process. Drug use was not just denounced as unhealthy, but as a tool of imperialism and capitalism. Drugs were destroyed in public burnings. Poppy fields were torn up and replanted with different crops. Hundreds of opium dealers were executed, and thousands more were sent to prison. As for the addicts themselves, many were forcibly sent to rehab facilities or made to suffer the brutal symptoms of opioid withdrawal in forced labor camps. Now, the ethics of China's methods are certainly debatable, but not the results. During the 1950s, China's tactics of government suppression and social reform effectively ended opium production and consumption among its people. Opium production then moved south of the Chinese border into the countries of Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand. By the 1960s, most of the world's opium, and eventually heroin, was produced in an area that came to be known as the Golden Triangle. Today, we basically come full circle. China is the world's largest producer of chemicals that are used by Mexican cartels to produce the powerful opioid fentanyl. And their number one customer? The United States. Is it karma? Is it revenge? Or is it simply history repeating itself? Let me know what you think in the comments. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for watching. Please do me a favor and hit the subscribe button down below. If you like this content, please share it with a friend. These episodes are only getting better, and I can't wait for you to see what I have in store for you next time. Until then, I'm Dr. Mark. I'll see you next time on RxTales.